This is the ATI.
Welcome back to the ATI podcast, everybody. We're happy to have you here. Barrett Lewis with you on the call as usual. Josh Welch to my side.
Hello, hello.
And we got a very special guest this week, Logan Cole. Logan, how are you doing, sir?
Doing all right. How are you guys?
Doing great. I know that you reached out to me kind of earlier on in the show and offered your services, and I appreciate you doing that because, you know, we're always looking for guests and content. And then furthermore, you know, you're different than a lot of our other guests. You know, we haven't had anybody kind of in this realm, you know, mask making.
Visual artists.
Yeah, visual artists. And
we all like to hide in caves.
Sort of thing. So we really appreciate having you on and help bringing that variety that we try to bring to our audience as well. And then we have an array of interests, you know, so, you know, not that I like to promote other people's podcasts sometimes, especially as more turdy as people have gotten over the years, but you know, like one of the best podcast episodes I've ever heard in my life is actually a Joe Rogan episode where Rick Baker was on. And I've always been fascinated by Rick Baker and his work and how he was able to do some of the masks. And, you know, like Thriller, for example, John Landis directed the Thriller music video, and I watched a lot of the behind the scenes stuff with that. American Werewolf in London, you know, that's another piece of iconic work from Rick Baker. But, you know, those were kind of my early fascinations, in particular with, you know, makeup and special effects and mask making. And then, of course, the old Universal movies. What got you into mask making and that sort of thing?
It's funny because it's actually very, very similar to that. There are two movies that I consider really instrumental in me being interested in this even a little bit. The first one was the 1941 Wolfman from Universal.
Absolutely.
And I had always been interested in those movies, even as a very, very young kid. In fact, like the first thing that I spent, the first VHS, I'll say, that I spent my allowance money on was The Wolfman.
Oh, nice. Hell yeah.
So,
what's wrong with that?
Oh, absolutely not.
I probably spent mine on something way more embarrassing.
Yeah.
So, I, as a very young kid, my fascination with that movie and the rest of the Universal monster movies was I was never really scared of them. I was more amazed that they could find actors that looked like that. It's like, how do you find somebody that looks like Frankenstein's monster? And, you know, how do you find somebody that can turn into the Wolfman? And my dad kind of sat me down and was like, "You're not a very smart person." He didn't say that, but he said, actually, it's basically like a really, really high quality Halloween costume. That was sort of the way he explained it to me. My 4-year-old brain. It's either the way he explained it or it's the way my 4-year-old brain understood it. Was that it was essentially a really, really high quality Halloween costume, and so what that sparked in me was, oh, you don't have to buy Halloween costumes at the store.
Right.
So for the next several years, my goal became every Halloween, I wanted a homemade Halloween costume, and my parents would indulge me in that, and they would help me make it. I would help them make it because I was a little kid. But I would tell them what I wanted and tell them kind of my ideas for things, and they would go, "Yeah, that could work," or "Let's try this because what you've come up with is not structurally sound and is going to fall apart."
Sure,
right.
If you take 2 steps in it. So for the next few years, that was kind of what I did. And as I got older, I got more involved in making my own Halloween costumes. And then when I was 12 years old, I was actually up late with my dad again, watching what do they call it? The AMC Fear Fridays thing that they used to do.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
yeah.
they played An American Werewolf in London, and I saw that, and I saw the transformation sequence, and I was absolutely floored. And my dad is a huge science fiction and horror fan, and he had a bunch of back issues of Fangoria from back in the 80s. And he had some SFX magazines and some stuff, and he dug those out and he let me read them, and that's where I learned about Rick Baker and Tom Savini and Stan Winston and Dick Smith and people like that. And I, at that point, realized that it was actually a career that you could have and you could do all year round, and you didn't have to save it up for one night in October.
Right.
Absolutely.
That's awesome, dude. That's cool. It's connected to even to your childhood. You've been doing it since you were a little kid, so that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
It's cool that you followed something that you were infatuated from when you were a kid. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you talking about some of your early interests as well, and you originally thinking that they found actors that look like that. It's funny that you mentioned that because I know with like some of the Wolfman type stuff that I saw when I was younger, it was real close to things like. We got a train rolling around the background. It's the charm of the show. Wolfman's chasing it down right now. I can hear him howling. But yeah, so like when I was younger, what got real popular was kind of like the Ripley's Believe It or Not type stuff, Guinness World Book of Records, those type of collections. And then like as cable programming expanded, they would have shows like introspective pieces or like, for example, they came across like the Cavemen Brothers. And years later, Geico would, make a character of them and be a part of their marketing blitzes and everything else. But there was literally, folks with genetic dispositions. I believe that they were middle America or perhaps from South America, if memory serves me correct. But it was actually brothers who had a genetic disposition that caused them to have very hairy features throughout their body. And I thought, well, that's probably how they made those movies. So it's funny that you had that thought. Because that was, and whenever you see the original, Wolfman from 1941 that you mentioned earlier, there's a very similar look there, actually. So I could see that as a kid, for sure.
Yeah, they've got that kind of hypertrichosis look to them.
Yes.
Where it's just mostly fur and very little prosthetic work that's making them look. Well, in fact, honestly, the prosthetic that I love Jack Pierce's work, but the prosthetic that he gave Lon Chaney Jr., for the Wolfman makes him look a little more like a feral hog than a werewolf.
Yeah, definitely.
I love the makeup, but it definitely does look a little more piggy than Wolfie.
Yeah.
Did you? I'm sure that you saw whenever they tried to, I guess, reboot the Wolfman as part of Universal's need for rebooting everything. I guess with Guillermo, or not? That wasn't Guillermo. It was Benicio del Toro. I'm sorry,
Benicio del Toro. Yeah,
and Anthony Hopkins. I actually thought it was all right. It definitely could have been better, but I was happy to see that they did take some more practical approaches with some of the makeup and effects there.
Yeah, well, and Rick Baker did the makeup for that film. He, in fact, I believe, as the story goes, he said that he would do it for free if they weren't going to hire him because of his fee, because he just wanted to work on that movie so bad.
Right.
But one of my favorite behind the scenes stories from that movie, which I believe he actually mentions on that Joe Rogan podcast, it's from his book Metamorphosis, which shameless plug for somebody else. If you're into that, you should check out Metamorphosis if you haven't. But he talked about having a fight with some of the money people behind the Wolfman reboot, and they were looking through his budget, and they said, why the hell are you spending thousands and thousands of dollars on hair? And he just looked over and he pointed at the logo for the movie, and he said, he's a Wolfman. If you don't have hair, he's just a man.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It seems so obvious, but the studios have just gotten so accustomed to everything becoming CGI'd as well. So like, and in some respects, yes, it is a cost cutting measure, and yes, there's a lot of things that you can do with computers nowadays that you couldn't, even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Certainly not 1941, but
CGI though, man, it will ruin some characters, especially werewolves. So. Like Underworld's a prime example of that. You know what I mean? Like
yes.
That's such a great movie, but the CGI work with the lichens is what kills it, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it's especially like very, very obvious when you compare it to the really, really nice suit work that's in that movie.
Right. Yeah, the costume kills it. Right.
They don't mesh well. I will say this, as far as CGI and werewolves, This may surprise some people, but I'm not totally against CGI. I don't hate it. I think it's a tool, and I think if you use it correctly, it can be really, really good. One of the best Wolfman designs came from a frankly not very good movie. And it was a pretty solid blend of CG and practical effects, and that was Skinwalkers. Stan Winston Studios handled the makeups for the characters, and they were about 90% practical makeups, but they did things like tweak their eyes and move them slightly farther apart and tilt them, just to give them more of an animalistic look. It's something you couldn't do without building like a full animatronic head. Right. But they preserved the performance, and like again, 90% of that was makeup. It was just the other 10% pushed it the rest of the way. And despite that movie just sucking, at least in my opinion, the werewolves look really good in it. So
CGI enhancing, being used as a tool, as an ancillary tool, I'm totally all about. And that's just the way it's going to be from now on. As far as CGI is concerned, it's gonna predominantly be in films. But I can go back and think of times, like it kind of in my adolescent years, like a big movie that I was really into at the time, American Werewolf in Paris, which is supposed to be technically a sequel to American Werewolf in London, but other than just kind of the mythos and what takes place in the movie from a literal operational standpoint, there's really no time factor beyond that, but it was semi-popular, but the werewolf in that is just so cheese-tastic, and CGI work. But you have to think about the times too. You're talking mid-late 90s,
I have some opinions on that movie.
Let's hear it.
I actually, this is going to surprise a lot of people, especially your previous guest, Doug Wicker. I don't hate that movie. I think it's a fun, cheesy movie. Like, it's not going to win any awards. But I will tell you this. So you said that it is not connected to An American Werewolf in London aside from the premise, like the general premise. There is actually one connection, and that is that Seraphine's mom is Alex Price from the first movie.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Wow.
So they don't make a big deal of it, and it's really only something you would know if you're a super nerd and have like read, breakdowns of what's supposed to happen in the movie. They were supposed to make it clearer, but the idea was that Alex from the first movie is the ghost that shows up in Seraphine's house at that one point, and that Seraphine is David's daughter, and that's why she's a werewolf. But the thing that grates me about that movie that I just cannot stand is when they show her transforming for the first time, and she's in the sewer, and she like pulls her skirt up and her leg breaks to bend backwards. Right. That's not anatomically correct. Like, I know I'm going to argue about anatomical accuracy in werewolves, but werewolves, that weird backwards bending leg that dogs have that they usually give werewolves, it's not backwards bending. That second bend is their ankle. They just have a really long foot, and they're standing on the balls of their feet. Right. So, whoever did that, like the fact that they didn't take 3 seconds to look at an anatomy book and figure that out just grates the shit out of me.
I think it was one of those movies that I watched a lot when it came out. I liked it a lot when it came out. It helped the fact that they had Bush on the soundtrack as well. Oh, yeah. So that I was really into that at the time. And, so it was kind of a product of its time in many ways. But there was a lot of movies actually that were close to that. They got overlooked. Like, I think kind of the sleeper movie that just came out within a few years of that is Brotherhood of the Wolf. I don't know if you ever saw that with Vincent Cassel.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty underrated movie, and a lot of people overlook it.
That is a batshit insane movie,
right? Yeah, and then also you don't see a lot of them made. Like, it's kind of a period piece, really, as well. And
it's a period piece, kung fu monster.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
and that's with werewolves in general, there's been a ton of the movies made. We kind of had this talk last week whenever we were doing our favorite horror movies panel, like with vampires in particular. Like, there's a lot of vampire movies. There's a lot of werewolf movies. There's not a lot of good ones. I mean, you can do a punch list of them, but by comparison as to how many has been churned out versus the quality. Good ones, the quality ones, and there's usually a huge drop off. There's not too many in the middle.
Oh, yeah.
They're either really good or they're really bad, and most of them are really bad.
Oh yeah,
for sure. So you mentioned a couple of names earlier too, and some other folks that I kind of want to hit on too. So I know that Stan Winston gets actually a lot of hate in the community because he eventually got himself to the point where essentially it became the Stan Winston school. And, he ended up having a lot of people that were, like, I guess, people that would join his school, if you will, people that were doing apprenticeships and what have you, working on his projects. So, like, people will discredit him in his name when his name is on things, in particular because he personally doesn't have the same touch or approach to films as perhaps like a Rick Baker as involved, or was, I should say, after a certain point, that is. Do you have a strong opinion about Stan Winston?
Oh, I mean, I like Stan Winston. He's not, on the same level as Rick Baker to me in terms of influence, but in terms of work, I mean, so let's just, to break that down, anybody who has a bad word to say about Stan Winston that has worked with him would surprise me, frankly, because he was always the guy that would give credit to the people that actually did the work. Because yeah, it is true that after a while he kind of stopped being very hands-on. But honestly, the reason he stopped being as hands-on was because he hired people that were strong, and he worked with them long enough that he started to learn their strengths, and he didn't feel like having to handhold them. Right. Nearly as much after he kind of got to know what they were good at. So he would just assign them things and kind of let them go. And, you can see the strength of the people that he did hire, not only in the product that they put out, but also the fact that, like, the guys, Alec Gillis and Tom Woodruff Jr. and Shane Mahan, they are still in the industry today, and they're, some of the bigger names that are still working in the industry today. And they went on to have Shane, I believe, still works at Legacy Effects, which is what Stan Winston's studio is now. And Alec Gillis so Alec and Tom Woodruff Jr. had Studio ADI, and then Tom Woodruff decided, I think he was going to go pursue a directing career. And so Alec Gillis kind of restructured his stuff, but he's still doing, a lot of stuff. He worked on Prey recently.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. I didn't realize
that was some fantastic work. But even absolutely, anybody that will, talk about Stan as not being, as much of an artist because he didn't have very hands-on touch, go back and watch Dead and Buried. Go back and watch something like The Entity. Go back and watch the movies that he actually had a hand in. I mean, he could clearly do the stuff. It's not like he was just a businessman that ran the company. It's just he got to a point. And going back to Rick Baker for a second, Rick was talking about in his book that he got to a point where, he had a family at home, and he would go into the shop and he would, like, only have the people that worked for him get a sculpture to, like, 40% of the way there, and then he would finish it the rest of the way to get the way he liked it. But then he was, skipping meals and coming home like late at night after his daughters had gone to bed. And he had kind of an epiphany at one point after talking to a studio executive that was talking about how, he missed his daughter's graduation, that he needed to pull back and kind of let people have more control over their individual work that they were contributing to the film. And I guess it was just that Stan figured that out a lot earlier.
Sure. Yeah, and I can see that for sure. And some people, I know you named some names of Stan Winston projects, but some people might be listening to or watching our show now and not realize other properties that he's touched. So he's done a lot of work with James Cameron in particular. So like the Terminator movies, Alien franchise, he is involved in that stuff. So, he's got some pretty, and you spoke about some of the animatronic stuff earlier, like he was a huge innovator in that section in and of itself, as well as the animatronic stuff being implemented and very realistic throughout movies. And, usually, yes, the sci-fi action type genres or whatever the case is, and horror, if you will. But yeah, Stan Winston, I still follow the Stan Winston School stuff on Instagram. It's some of my favorite content that's out there. It's just so fascinating to see how they, do these animatronics and everything else, and some of the makeup effects that they do in particular. another guy that you fired off on earlier, and who I think is the most underrated guy of all, is Tom Savini. And a lot of people they'll see him and they'll recognize him. Oh, he's in this or he's in that. Like
Sex Machine.
Yeah, absolutely. He was in, if anybody's seen Martin, he was a boyfriend in Martin as well. That was kind of one of his earlier acting roles.
That's one of my top 3 favorite movies, by the way.
I do like Martin quite a bit. Yeah, I actually had never seen it until during the pandemic. I had a list of movies that I hadn't gotten around to, and Martin was one of them, and I watched it, about 2 years ago and really enjoyed it. And, I don't think enough people do talk about Martin in particular, but, back to Tom Savini, but people don't realize the work that he's done and the influence that he's had in the industry as well. And some of the films are you a fan of Tom Savini? What's some of his work that you've enjoyed?
Oh, I love Tom Savini. So, when I kind of started my journey into wanting to become a makeup effects artist, I was really lucky because there's a year-round Halloween shop about an hour away from where I grew up. And because I grew up in the middle of a swamp, driving an hour away is not that big of a deal because you had to do literally anything. So they carried Tom Savini's Grand Illusions book 1 and 2. So those were the first books that I snapped up about makeup effects. And they were the first books that really kind of gave me a peek into what it was like to work on a film. And so I, just from reading those books, got a huge appreciation from Tom Savini for Tom Savini. I don't think he appreciates my work. I don't think he knows who I am. But
you never know. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, one can hope. But I just became a huge fan of his work through that, and eventually. So this is a kind of a funny aside: is that I have a ton of collections of physical media, and I have collections of physical media based on the makeup effects artists that worked on them. And
cool.
Tom Savini is one of my collections. Probably the weirdest movie in the collection I have of his is a movie called Till Death Do We Scare, which was shot in Hong Kong back in 1981, I think.
Oh, wow.
It's a really goofy movie. It's like a Hong Kong ghost movie. There's a character that does kind of a Warrant cherry pie, giant smile gag at one point.
Yeah.
But my favorite thing that Tom Savini did is kind of a toss up between, oddly enough, this this Dr. Tongue that I made years and years ago.
Uh-huh.
It kind of looks shitty up close in the camera, but
that looks awesome.
Years and years ago,
It, man.
I made this Dr. Tongue because I love that zombie from Day of the Dead.
Right.
But my absolute favorite thing that Tom Savini ever did is a movie that the movie gets a lot of appreciation, but it doesn't get a lot of appreciation for Tom's work because Tom is known as a gore guy.
Sure.
And that's Creepshow.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say Creepshow to me is one of the all-time underrated films, period. And
Creepshow.
Anytime somebody starts talking anthology horror movies, Creepshow is one of the first movies I start talking about.
Yeah, Nate is my absolute favorite zombie in anything.
That's cool.
That he's such a cool design, just a skeleton with just rotted flesh hanging off of him, and a good chunk of that rotted flesh was Rice Krispie treats that were stuck on.
That's awesome.
Hey man, it worked out perfectly though too. And it's funny, those little tricks of the trade too that they implement sometimes. And I know Tom's kind of a run and gun type guy, bang, like a baller with a budget is like I like to refer to it as. he makes the most out of the least.
Right.
That's kind of my appreciation for him. And he's kind of largely in bed with George Romero. Obviously, he's done a lot of work with him in particular. Starred in his films, even whether it's bit parts, more major parts, if you will. But and obviously you could see why, and as his work progressed over time, as well as he got better and better with even with his stuff he did specifically with George. But he's done things outside of that, of course. And like Maniac, he was involved in Maniac as well, and that's another one that folks overlook as far as his work's concerned.
Yeah, that I like the story about him shooting his own head off in Maniac.
Yeah.
So, was it Disco Boy is the name of the character he plays in that movie?
Yes.
And Zito shows up and just like unloads the shotgun on him through the windshield of the car. Well, Tom was the one who pulled the trigger on the dummy of himself, and they did not have a permit to fire a shotgun in New York, because I don't know if it's the same now, but at the time I don't think you could get a permit to fire a shotgun in New York if you were, not on the police department or whatever.
Yeah.
So
right.
they paid off some police officer, and they got out there, they started filming. He points the gun at the dummy of himself, unloads both barrels into the head. It explodes. They catch it. One off-duty police officer takes the gun, puts it in the trunk of his car, and drives one way. And one officer leads Tom to another car and drives the other way. And then they push the car off into the river.
That's hilarious.
That's genius.
Yeah, that's amazing, man. And yeah, like a lot, especially in New York, it's really hard to get permits to do things, and this is going to tie Tom into some other parts of his work that people don't realize that he's involved with. But, I'm a big fan of professional wrestling. Sometimes we have some professional wrestling centric episodes and what have you. But Tom's actually really good friends with Bray Wyatt, Wyndham Rotunda, and he actually did the Fiend mask for Bray Wyatt, which is a fantastic mask and menacing as hell.
So here's a funny thing about that. I don't know if this is like a true thing. It's a suspicion that I have. And I think it's a pretty good bet to make, but I would love to ask Tom Savini. If I had one question to ask him, it would be this, and it would be kind of a dumb question to blow if you only had one question to ask Tom Savini. But I would ask him if I'm right about this. So I was watching a makeup video from the late 80s, early 90s. So there's a very famous video of Tom Savini talking about makeup effects. It's like a 20-minute clip. I think John Russo was the one that directed it. And it's just him talking about like working on the movie Heartstopper and a couple of other things that he did in the early 90s, late 80s. And you can get that on a DVD. And it also has another thing that John Russo either produced or shot or something, that is Dick Smith doing kind of out of the kit makeups on some kid. Because at the time that was always the setup, is like the neighbor kid would wander over and want you to do makeups on him.
Yeah.
But
hilarious.
he does this sunburnt vampire makeup, and I swear to you, it is the Fiend mask. Like it is
check that out.
The coloration, the way the mouth looks, like everything about it. If you stop it at a certain point before he's completely finished with the makeup, it's the Fiend mask. I'll see if I can dig up the picture and I'll send it to you and you guys can post it.
That'd be cool. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I know Tom Savini would have seen that. So,
absolutely. And it might have even been like a subliminal thing where, he saw it at one time and it just worked. You got to think a guy like that, what hasn't he seen? Right? In the business for real. But I always just took it as, some play off of like the Joker. So like there's a series, and I used to collect comic books quite a bit as well. There's a Greg Capullo, Scott Snyder series. It kind of ties in close to like the Court of the Owl stuff, but whenever they did a Batman reboot about 10 years ago, there's a version of the Joker where he actually like has a like peeled skin face as his mask. And it looks very similar to that. So I always just assumed that might have been a part of the inspiration, but again, it's Tom Savini's one
also that,
But I always took it as that being kind of the springboard point.
Yeah. Speaking of that Joker in particular, have you ever seen Rick Baker's makeup of that Joker?
I have not.
I have not either.
No.
So every year for Halloween, Rick and his family have like a themed makeup that they do. And a few years back, the theme was Joker. And so he made his two daughters up as different versions of the Joker. One of them was the Heath Ledger Joker in a nurse costume. The other was like the Killing Joke Joker. And then he was Joe Kerr with the pulled back face mask.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah, it's on his Instagram.
Josh is showing it to me right now.
I pulled it up.
Dude, that's wicked. That's awesome. We're gonna have to put that up.
Yeah,
too.
We'll definitely have to share that.
Yeah, I'd never seen that before.
It's fantastic.
I know, like some people in Hollywood will hire him sometimes to do their Halloween makeup and stuff. I want to say that Heidi Klum has at least once, if not twice.
I don't know. I don't know if she's hired him specifically. I know she hires Mike Marino a lot. she may have hired him before she started hiring Mike, but I know for the past several years she's hired Mike Marino.
And maybe The Weeknd also. I thought he used The Weeknd.
Yes, yeah. He also he got his makeups done, like that Halloween thing with the, I don't know exactly what it was called, but with like botched plastic surgery was done by Mike Marino too. For you guys out there that don't follow this stuff as obsessively as I do, Mike Marino, you would know for doing the incredible penguin makeup in the Batman. I'm blanking on his name.
Tim Burton's Batman.
No, Colin Farrell.
The reason Colin Farrell, yeah.
Oh, okay,
where he looks like a real human being, not in a makeup, but looks absolutely nothing like Colin Farrell.
I thought he put on the weight. I mean, I think he did a little, but not to that level.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he put on a little weight, but most of that is makeup. That's that's.
Yeah, he looks like a completely different person, right?
Yeah,
and it moves so naturally, and that's the hardest thing. This is a thing a lot of people don't necessarily realize is the hardest thing to do convincingly is a character makeup that is supposed to be a convincing human being.
Right,
like if you're looking, anybody out there that is interested in becoming a makeup effects artist, it's really easy to slap gore on stuff. It's really easy to throw blood at somebody. It's really easy to do fake injuries and stuff like that. Now, you can do them convincingly, or you can do them kind of shoddily. But it's really easy to do them even convincingly if you have a little bit of practice. Putting a nose dead center on somebody's face and making it so convincing that somebody wouldn't even look twice at them is the hardest thing to do.
Right.
Yeah.
I've read a thing.
They're hardwired to look at human faces, and we look at human faces all the time. So,
yeah, I read a thing that actually the people that did the makeup for the penguin, they actually took him out into like a cafe and like through the city and stuff just to test the makeup to make sure that nobody recognized him. Like they didn't tell nobody who he was. He wore the makeup around town. He did the whole character and everything, and they said it was flawless. Nobody even realized what they were doing.
I think the Safdie brothers did a similar gag where they went into a diner a few years back. I cannot remember why they did it. It was in promotion of something.
Yeah.
But the Safdie brothers did like Uncut Gems and Good Time.
Yeah.
But like I just love a good gag with makeup effects,
Yeah.
for real, like fooling people.
Yeah.
But another Tom Savini thing I want to bring up too is a lot of people may not realize this as well, but he's done some collaborations with Corey Taylor from Slipknot, helped him design some of his masks too. So,
oh wow,
Tom Savini's kind of got his fingerprints across all forms of media, really.
Right.
Not just the movie industry explicitly, but music and as well as professional wrestling, so other areas of entertainment for sure. So that's why I consider him in part, to be kind of like the most underrated people ever, in this genre. Is there any other big influences or people that you were drawn to, getting into the work?
Oh, I mean, Rick Baker and Jack Pierce are the biggest ones. Tom Savini is a very, very, very close one behind there. Stan Winston, we've already talked about. Aside from that, the biggest, I would say, influences are actually kind of mask makers that have a style that I really like, and that's sculptors like Jordu Shell. His work is just incredible. He's worked on some. I think he designed the Na'vi for Avatar, but I don't hold that against him.
Yeah, right.
But like his mask work is just fantastic, and. There's a guy I'm totally blanking on his name.
What's some projects that he's worked with outside of Avatar as far as his mask work that people might be familiar with?
So in terms of masks, there's a company called Distortions Unlimited, and they're probably like outside of mask collector places they're most well known for. They were on a TV show on the Travel Channel called Making Monsters.
Yeah.
And Ed Edmonds and the Distortions Unlimited crew. And Jordu Shell was actually on that show a little bit.
Okay.
They had a line of masks through the 80s that were just like kind of pushing the envelope of what you saw in Halloween masks, both in terms of quality and in terms of like just weird stuff that you would see, gore
Yeah.
and just bizarre creatures. And so Jordu did a bunch of tribute. I wouldn't really call them tribute masks because they were for distortions, but basically he went through their back catalog and he re-sculpted all of their original masks. I don't know if he did all of them, but he re-sculpted a bunch of their original masks to like a much higher quality, and those were like recently re-released. He does a lot of portraiture work and a lot of commission work and stuff. But he's worked on a bunch of different movies as well. He did, I believe, some concept work for Hellboy, the Guillermo del Toro Hellboy.
The one that matters.
Off the top of my head, that's all I can remember that worked on him. Yeah, him and Mike Rotella and people like that are just fantastic sculptors that I like to watch work, just to inspire me.
You know, I don't want to spend too much time on as far as the inspirations and things, because I know that you are actively doing work out there in the field too. So, I know that, you know, as far as displaying your work and some of that before we got on the call today, you kind of opened up the curtain to us and let us know that, you know, sometimes you can't show that work until the finished product's out there for mass consumption. So, you know, let's talk about, you know, kind of, let's get into more so some of the logistics, the behind the scenes stuff, like what actually goes into, you know, making these. I know that you make masks and you do sculpts, and I know you do makeup effects for folks and projects and that sort of thing. Like, let's get into some of the nuts and bolts, you know, like if somebody's wanting to get into this, you know, this field, where would you recommend them to start with as far as getting a foundation for the work, like what's entailed into it, that sort of stuff?
So I would say that anybody that wants to get into it now is a lot luckier than I was when I wanted to get into it originally, because back when I first got into it, I had old issues of SFX and Fangoria to try and like use a magnifying glass and look through the background of pictures to see what chemicals people had on their shelves to try and figure out like, you know, what somebody was using. Like I distinctly remember looking through the SFX issue with Rick Baker and trying to figure out like what materials and what paints he was using for things. And it's a black and white magazine, so you can imagine the difficulty in doing that.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But like looking at the sculpting tools that he was using and trying to imitate the moves that he was doing, which I now realize he was posing in front of this thing with the sculpting tool. He wasn't actually sculpting, but like at the time I was, you know, trying to do that. But so what I would suggest people do now is there are a ton of resources that are free, and there are a ton of resources you can pay for. If you want to pay for some stuff, go to Stan Winston School. You can do a la carte, and you can buy all kinds of videos about literally any kind of makeup effects thing you want to learn how to do, any kind of mask making thing you want to learn how to do. They have a video on it. It can get a little pricey. You know, they're about $60 a video. So, you know, if you want to learn how to do a whole bunch of stuff, that could be a lot of money. But they also do have like a yearly subscription thing that you can pay for. So I think if you're going to buy that much, it's probably worth it to do the yearly subscription.
Right.
But there are also a lot of free resources out there, and I'm going to shout out a couple of them because one of the problems with free resources is there's no quality control on them. So there have been, I used to spend a lot of time on forums, mask making forums with people that were just getting into it. I'm a little busier now, so I can't do that as much. But I used to spend a lot of time on those forums, and people would say, I tried this and it didn't work. And, you know, you dig into it and it's like they tried it because they watched some dumbass's video that themselves don't actually know what they're doing.
Right.
And if you don't know what you're doing, you don't know what to look for in a video as a marker for quality. So videos that I can channels that I can vouch for in terms of them being good resources is Distortions Unlimited's channel. Actually has on YouTube, they have a series of videos called Monster Lab, and Ed Edmonds takes you through sculpting a monster mask, making a mold of a monster mask, casting it in latex, how to paint it, how to finish it, all that stuff. And each of the videos is like an hour long roundabout. So, I mean, he goes in depth and doesn't really cut out a ton of stuff except for like time drying. And there's another channel called Stilt Beast Studios. Stilt Beast is all one word. and it's run by a guy named Alan Hops, and he is the I think his title is creative director for Dark Hour Haunted House in Plano, Texas. And in his free time, when he's not working on the haunted house, he posts a bunch of how-to videos on there. And so there's mask making videos, there's all kinds of fabrication videos. Fabrication is a big thing that gets kind of a bad rap too, because sometimes you don't have time to sculpt and mold and cast something. Sometimes you just gotta make it. Right. But he does sculpting, mold making, fabrication videos, and they're how-to videos, but he also just live streams his work. So sometimes he'll just set up the camera in the shop, and you can watch him for 3 hours sculpting on a mask, or making a mold, or casting multiple masks and pulling them and painting them. So it's a great resource in terms of
especially if you want to get in the weeds, do it. Yeah.
But it's an even better resource because not only do you get to see like the edited videos that explain how he does it, but you also get to see real time how long this shit actually takes. And that's something people really, really don't necessarily have the greatest grasp on if they're diving head first into this and have never done it, is you're going to spend a lot of time waiting around on stuff to dry. But his live stream videos do a really good job of conveying that. And also, since they're live streams, if you catch him whenever he goes live, you can ask him questions. It can be related to whatever he's doing, or it can be like, hey, I have this idea for a costume or a mask or whatever. How would you go about that? And, sometimes I disagree with the answers that he gives, but I don't think they're bad answers. It's just not necessarily the way I would tackle a problem. Yeah, but, for sure. The answers are typically good and well thought out and will get you to a result that's at least, an approximation of what you're looking for, regardless of skill level. So I think he's a really good resource.
And, another thing that I don't want to gloss over is fabrication too. Like, that's a different aspect of the game as well. And I'm sure that a lot of that has changed over the years too, with advancements of technology. I don't know if this is something that you've noticed directly. Are you seeing a lot of, and it has to be going on, and I can't say that I personally have seen a lot of it, but 3D printing, I would imagine, has changed the game there too, and perhaps made things easier, more accessible. Have you noticed much of an influence in the game, that being implemented in particular?
Oh, absolutely. It's really good for a few key things. One of them is rapid prototyping for anything, especially if it's a fairly low resolution of something that you're looking to create. You can give somebody a 3-dimensional example of it, even if it's not as high resolution as the finished product is going to be. Another thing is making like internal mechanics for creature suits. So, if you have like a monster head and it has like all these different lip movements and eyebrow movements and stuff like that, you have to build an understructure that will do those movements. And to make those understructures, like if you do it the traditional way, not involving 3D printing, it's a lot of, it's kind of a pain in the ass, frankly, but
a lot of busy work.
Yeah. But, designing it in, a CAD software and then printing it is a lot easier, even if you have to make a mold of that and then cast it in something a little more resilient than whatever resin you're printing in. It takes way less time than claying up the inside of your mold and then fiberglassing that and taking it out and cutting it out and, attaching all your pivot points and running all your conduit and stuff. And, it's a lot faster. And then the third thing that happens with it a lot is, some people are actually they'll sculpt a mask in ZBrush or whatever, and then they will invert it and print an inverted print that is their negative mold. So they can take this inverted print and pour material into it and then pull it out, and they've got a mask, and they never have to make a mold.
That's pretty genius.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's people that kind of with the old school thought like that's cheating though too, right? I mean, is there?
Yeah.
I don't personally feel that way. There are people that feel that way. I'm not one of them, although I'm also not somebody who uses 3D printing in my process, frankly, because I just don't like it.
Sure.
I'm fine with the end result, but I do this because it's a thing that I enjoy to do. And so as much of a hassle as it is to, like I said, clay up a mold and do the fiberglass work on the inside of it and stuff,
Right.
I would rather do that than sit and click on a
part of the
computer for,
passion,
a couple of hours.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I will say though, I have seen I'm a big Star Wars fan. I follow a lot of cosplayers and stuff for Star Wars, and they print some incredible sets of armor and stuff from the printers with that stuff. I'm like, holy
hard
crap.
edge,
Definitely.
hard edge sculptures like that. It's honestly like the smartest way to go because it's very difficult to get that look without a lot of effort any other way.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And then certainly, I guess the big thing that we haven't addressed here too, and good for you bringing up the point, Josh, is cosplay, and is the fact that, when it comes to 3D printing in particular, it definitely makes it more achievable for folks to do. Yeah. There's a lot of, at-home software. There's machines out there nowadays, the household machines that you can buy just at a lot of retailers, quite frankly, that can do. So, there's a certain level of a Cricut machine that you can buy, for example, that does some 3D printing.
Right, yeah,
and that sort of stuff.
You can go online and purchase prints. You can find geniuses that can make these awesome sculptures online and just purchase their prints and, print it. It's cool.
For sure. So outside of looking in magazines back in the day for yourself and trying to see what kind of chemistry they had working on the shelves and shit, what are some other things that you did to kind of fine-tune your crafts and so on and so forth over time?
Oh, I mean, I just did it. So, I had a lot of these misconceptions about things, and I tried them out, and they didn't work. And I did some more research, and I tried out some more stuff, and really and truly, that's it. Since I was 12, 13 years old, on my back porch when I was, I think, 13 years old, I had a skull that I had stuck down on a stick. It was actually a forensic skull. So it was meant for forensic reconstruction. It was like a CSI thing that you could buy at the Discovery store or whatever. Yeah. And so I took that skull and I wrapped it in aluminum foil and I made a werewolf snout. And I covered that in fiberglass, and I got fiberglass resin all over the dryer. That dryer, nobody that I know still lives in that house, but that dryer I'm sure still has fiberglass resin on it. So I made this fiberglass werewolf head, and then I pulled it off there, cleaned all the foil out, sculpted the outside of it, made a mold. Absolutely, completely, and totally fucked up my first mold that I ever made, and then I had to resculpt it again and remold it. And that made me a stronger sculptor and a stronger mold maker because every single time I broke a sculpture or broke a mold after I had molded the sculpture, I had to remake the sculpture. I couldn't go back to just remake the mold. The sculpture got destroyed when I took it out of the mold. And so if the mold was gone, I had to just start over. Right. And so that kind of trial and error was very instructive for me, especially because, and this is a piece of advice I would give to anybody that is interested in this stuff, you can't quit. There are going to be things that happen that are difficult. There are going to be things that you don't expect to happen that are going to make it harder or that are going to make it seem just thoroughly impossible. You're going to mess up. You're going to break something. You're going to have to start over on something. This brilliant plan that you had that you think is going to work is not going to work out at all. And you're going to have to go back to square one. And if you can't do that, you can't professionally do makeup effects because you have to be able to think on your feet and fix those problems as they come up.
Yeah. And, I can imagine it is pretty frustrating. It probably does require quite a bit of patience to do this. And, you have to kind of check the ego at the door too, in some instances, in the sense that you got to come with a lot of humility. You're going to make mistakes. But honestly, you could say that about anything, kind of more my background's being a musician. So, there's plenty of times that I've sat in the room and I might've been the best musician, but there's more times that I sat in the room and I was the worst musician. So, you can get humbled real quick. So it's definitely it's just another one of those things that, and certainly some of the things that you've highlighted already in our conversation, there are resources out there to help you become a better, makeup effects artist, mask maker, sculptor, whatever the case is. There are resources now that, don't think that, the example that you just used, for example, just because you have to start at ground zero, there might be an opportunity for you to actually learn there and how to more efficiently do the work, and, but yeah, nowadays there's just like so many resources that I say kids, I'm in my mid to late 30s now, but I say kids, but they don't know a reality outside of this. Like everything's at your fingertips, like literally anything that you want to know. I even have a hard time like remembering like, oh, I can just say, hey Siri or hey Alexa, or just Google something, like I'm like, still there's this part of me, this like innate primitive part of me that thinks that I just have to figure it out myself. I need to take the rock and bang it against the stick.
You need to go find the bookshelf, get the encyclopedia, or not the encyclopedia. Yeah, whatever it's called.
Encyclopedia Britannica or whatever. Yeah. But yeah, there are so many resources out there. So people, even if you don't have the patience, there is a resource somewhere.
Yeah,
for sure.
And I will say, for people that are worried that they don't have the patience, most of the people that know me would say that I'm one of the least patient people that they know. It's just, if you have an interest or a passion in something, you kind of have to practice patience for that thing.
Right.
So.
Right. Oh, sure, absolutely. And I think if there is a passion or an interest, that innately you start to learn to have that patience, if you will.
Yeah.
I want to get into some of the, I know you got a lot of work posted up on Instagram in particular. So I've seen some various masks and sculpts and things that you've been working on over time. And again, I know back to earlier, you can only put out so much right now too, depending on what you're working on and what's been released and so on and so forth. What are some of your more prized pieces of work that you can flaunt for us?
So I'll tell you about one that I can't show pictures for yet. Because it's one of my favorites. Doug Wicker and I actually, back in January, worked on a short with a filmmaker named Mondo Franco, who's a good friend of mine. We actually became friends working on that movie, honestly. And it's a short called Bruja, and I won't describe too much of what happens in it, but there's some subliminal creature stuff that happens in there. And the creature that I sculpted for those subliminal shots is one of my favorite creatures. Not just design-wise, but also because she's actually a miniature. Because we didn't want to spend a ton of money on it. So she's just kind of a subliminal thing that happens sometimes, and so she doesn't have any context for her size anywhere, so you could make her any size you wanted.
Right.
But she's one of my favorite creatures, and I can't wait for everybody to be able to see her, because she's one of those things that I've kind of privately shown off to some people. Yeah. That is just one of my favorite pieces of work. I really like. There's a mask that I did for a company called Nightmare Shop, and they're defunct now. You guys talked about them with Andy a couple weeks ago, actually, I think.
Sure did.
So unfortunately they're not around anymore, but they had a mascot character named Meltdown the Clown, and he was like a toxic waste clown. Mm-hmm. And I met those guys at Late Night Grindhouse, and we got to talking about working on a mask for their company. And that mask turned into several masks. And but the first one I did for him was Meltdown. I sculpted a little maquette that was about that big to just kind of show him what I was thinking, because the design that they had for the clown, it was a really cool illustration. But if you don't design something assuming that it's going to occupy physical space, it doesn't necessarily obey the laws of physics. So there was a lot of stuff in that illustration that couldn't actually be translated to reality. So I had to take it and do some sketches and do some like maquette sculpting for it to show them what I was thinking and kind of proof of concept for them. And after they approved that, I sculpted. It's a huge mask. It's like this big.
Oh, wow.
And it's one of my favorite sculptures I've ever done. I think the mask is really cool looking. And then as far as effects, I won't say what movie this is in because I don't want to spoil anything. So, you could watch this movie and still go in blind. Pun intended a little bit. Okay. But one of my favorite effects is there was a movie I worked on where I got to shove a corkscrew in somebody's eye.
Oh, wow.
And that was one of my favorite effects because it's actually 3 effects. This is a thing people that aren't crazy people don't necessarily think about, is that sometimes in order to get an effect, to sell an effect, you actually have to do it multiple ways. Right. And so there's a shot where a character grabs a corkscrew, and this is just a little, not that I'm an expert on this, far be it from me to, claim to be that. But if you're going to do an effect, here's, in my opinion, the best way to do it. You have to have a prove it for everything involved in that effect. And that prove it is like, show that the person involved in it is a real person. Show that the weapon, for instance, in this case, the corkscrew, is a real weapon or a real object. And then have them interact with each other. Good example of that that's not mine is Tom Savini's axe to the face that he does in the first Friday the 13th movie. They prove that the axe is real by having it hit a light bulb that's swinging above. You can obviously see that the actress is real because she's emoting and stuff. And then the way they got away with that effect and sold it is that in the shot where it hits her, it's a fake head and a real axe. And then the shot where she's sliding down the wall, it's her with a fake axe in her face. So the combination of those things makes it harder to tell as an audience kind of what you're going for. So this corkscrew gag, you see it go into her eye, and then you see like this corkscrew sticking out of their face, and then you see them having the corkscrew ripped out of their face and blood spraying everywhere. And so each of those 3 components was its own effect. Yeah. I did a live cast of their face and did a clay pour in it and sculpted it so their eye was open, because when you take a live cast, you don't typically do it with somebody's eyes closed. Yeah, or right. Eyes open, rather. Right. So I sculpted their eye open and made a latex duplicate of their face and painted it to look like their face and put in eyelashes and eyebrows and painted the eye and all that stuff. And then you actually see the corkscrew come into contact with that eyeball.
That's awesome. Wow. Better get the shot right the first time, too. Yeah.
Oh, well, it was good enough that like it would bounce back, so we could just reset it for.
Oh, okay.
But because we didn't get the shot right the first time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We actually didn't get the shot right the first 3 times.
To rebuild that every time.
We didn't get the shot right the first 3 times, so we had to keep resetting it. But eventually, we got it right. And so the second effect, where they come up and you see the little thing sticking out of the corkscrew sticking out of their eye. The way we did that is I took that same live cast and I made a little plastic shell that fit over their eyelid. And that plastic shell had a corkscrew, a plastic corkscrew that I had made sticking out of the end of it. And it fit into a foam handle of the corkscrew that I had cast. And then I sculpted a prosthetic that was just their eyelid that fit over the top of that plastic plate. And I went in, I glued the plastic plate down over their eye with prosthetic adhesive. I glued the prosthetic down, and then I popped that corkscrew handle on the end of the corkscrew and then just bloodied it up and everything. And so they could be totally hands-free, and they're like, ah! And then this thing is shaking around in their eye, and, and then the final shot, they pull the corkscrew out of the eye. We did that the cheapest way possible. I have a stick, and I'm standing on the away camera side of the performer. And like this is the side that the camera's pointing at, and I'm over here. And I have this stick that has a tube that is run to a syringe filled with blood. And glued onto the side of the stick is a block of foam that the actual corkscrew is stuck in. And so we lined it up so it looked like it was sticking out of their face if you look in profile. And the other actor reaches up, grabs the corkscrew, and pulls it out. And at that point, I hit the plunger, and the blood starts pouring out. Now, another fun aside about this is that we were shooting in a location where we didn't tell them we were shooting a horror movie. They were under the impression it was a romantic comedy. And it was an Airbnb.
Oh, so, that's hilarious.
So we couldn't get blood on anything. And so I was really like underselling the amount of blood I was going to spray out of this thing because I was afraid I was going to get it all over the wallpaper. Yeah. And it goes, and it's just a little dribble that comes out.
Like a pathetic.
Yeah,
Sad
and we
money
tried
shot.
it again, and like I couldn't get an in between. I was too afraid to go for it, and so it just kept, And this is one of the reasons that I can't hate on digital is because what ended up happening. I ended up watching the cut of the movie later, and I was like, "Wow, that blood looks amazing! How did we do that?" And the director told me, he's like, it was digital. And I said, that's digital blood? Digital blood looks like shit. And how did we do that? This guy is like the best digital blood person I've ever seen. And so I found out what actually happened is they took the little dribbles of blood and they isolated them and just blew them up really big.
There you go.
That's a good idea, actually.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
But it ended up looking great, and we didn't get blood on anything, so we didn't have to pay any damages.
So it ended up being perfect.
Hell yeah,
Yeah,
dude, you can't beat that for sure. Yeah, that's another funny thing too, and it kind of goes back to the permits thing that you were talking about earlier with Tom Savini whenever they were shooting, and I was going to use an example too at the time. Like I listen to a lot of like pro wrestling podcasts, and they talk about kind of like behind the curtain type stuff, things that they have to, and they use a lot of practical effects guys to do stuff too. Even like they have stages and stunts and things that they do, like lighting people on fire and just wacky shit like that, burying people alive, so on and so forth. But there's a lot of crossover there. And you don't think about like a lot of the, I'll just say red tape that you have to go through from time to time in getting the shot that you want, and working across these various departments too, So back to the Tom Savini thing, like firing a gun in New York, like up until here recently, like you cannot conceal and carry in New York. You cannot take weapons into private places and that sort of stuff. Like I can imagine just like the hell that a person would have to go through. And then to relate that to your project as well, like you guys are renting an Airbnb to make this happen, and under the guise that you're doing a romantic comedy sort of thing, and it turns out it's a horror movie. Like people don't think about like the tiptoe delicate dance that you have to do to get shit done like this, and you can't be like, oh, we're shooting a horror movie, and so because people are going to automatically assume the worst, people jump to like The Exorcist or whatever, and they think, oh my God, they're going to be railing crucifixes and everything inside of our place. We want to be associated with this.
And in fact, actually, there was a movie I worked on where the crew most of the crew apparently just didn't read the script.
Oh my
before
God.
shooting until like a couple of days before shooting, and they read it the night before shooting, and like half of them walked because they were uncomfortable with the content of the film. It was a horror movie, and it had some brutal stuff in it, and I was a small part of some of that brutal stuff, but it's a movie. Like, it's all fake. You're making the movie, it's fake. Like, it's not
right. Yeah, that's the thing that I've never really quite understood. Now, contingent on what everybody has a threshold, if you will, and but at the end of the day, yes, it's fake, and if you're taking on a job. This is where I kind of go back to it's on those people. They should have fucking written the script if they're going to take the job.
Right. Exactly.
They had plenty of time. So that's kind of ridiculous that you just walk in the last minute. It'd be one thing if there's like, issues over pay or, something like that, unforeseen or a check didn't clear or whatever.
Right.
But when it comes to that's on you. You didn't read the script,
Yeah.
So getting into some of your other projects as well, I know we've kind of talked about some practical effect type stuff and mask making as well. I know there's a lot that goes into mask making though, in particular, like the certain latexes that you have to use outside of, the molding that we've kind of hit on a little bit as well. And then of course, if you're incorporating hair or other, wacky things when it comes to, making a mask, it really at the end of the day, what is your end goal? What is the project? What are you working on? Can you talk a little bit about some of your more prized masks that you've worked on as well, and kind of what's went into that?
Yeah. So mask making is kind of funny. I used to really look down on mask making because my thought about mask making was it's what people do if they're not good enough to be makeup effects artists. Because, a mask is a static thing and it's not something that emotes like a makeup does. And I want to say, just to clarify, I don't think that anymore. And I don't think that anymore because mask making is a really fun art form that shares a lot of similarities to makeup effects in the execution of certain processes. But the end goal is different in a way. So with makeup effects, you're either doing a gag of some kind, like, a blood gag or an injury or something like that, or you are creating a character. With mask making, it's purely creating a character. And the thing that's different about mask making than makeup effects is that when you're creating a character for makeup effects, you're creating that character on top of somebody else, and you're bringing it to life in a way, and then somebody else, the performer underneath, is also bringing it to life in their own way. And so you're essentially collaboratively creating a character, and they're also collaborating with the screenwriter and cinematographer and director and all that to create this performance and create this character. When you sculpt a mask, when you make a mask, you're making that character yourself. You're the only person responsible for making that character. You give it its personality. You give it every aspect of it. It's not reliant on anybody else. So it is a very it's a very purely creative art form for people that have to rely on collaboration for everything else. And don't get me wrong, collaboration is great and results in some incredible stuff. Every single movie you've ever seen is a collaborative work between, tons of people that are doing a dance and making it work. But at the end of the day, if you're a creative person, which some people might accuse me of being, then sometimes it's nice to be able to do that creative process from step one to the final step. And mask making gives you the ability to do that. And it also gives you kind of a neat thing to be able to just hang up in your house and show off to people.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, it uses a lot of the same materials and uses a lot of the same methods. You sculpt a mask, you make a mold of a mask, you cast it up in either latex or silicone or neoprene or anything like that. You paint it. You want to paint them typically realistically, unless it's a really weird fantasy character or something like that.
Sure.
And when you're finishing the characters, you want to throw in these nice finishing touches to make it read realistically and read just super creepy or whatever the character you're going for is. So. I mean, for me, kind of, there's a roundabout way of getting to your question, but my favorite masks that I've worked on, like I said, one of them is that Meltdown mask. I love that sculpture. One of them is a werewolf mask that I did a few years ago, and I don't know if you can tell, I really love werewolves. So,
Sure.
they're my favorite monster, and so it's hard for me to go a couple of years without sculpting a new werewolf thing of some kind.
Sure.
In fact, actually, I'm working on a new werewolf sculpture. I finished a new werewolf sculpture. I'm working on the castings for that. Presently, I'm kind of holding off because I'm working on some other stuff at the moment. But that werewolf mask I did a couple of years ago, I really love. I love the expression on it. I think it's kind of the hairline reminds me of Oliver Reed from Curse of the Werewolf. So
Okay.
I'm kind of happy about that, even though that was a little bit of an accident. But I spent 8 hours hairing that thing.
Oh my God. Yeah, I could imagine that's a pretty crazy part of the mask making process in and of itself too.
Yeah.
Is just especially with werewolves, is all that hair, man, that you have to leave in there for sure. Yeah. Did you see Werewolf by Night by chance yet?
I did.
What do you think of that?
Werewolf by Night is one of my favorite comic book characters of all time.
Yeah.
I have a Marvel Comics Presents #2,
Hell yeah.
which was Werewolf by Night's first appearance. And I really, really dug that special. I've watched it twice already. I plan on watching it a couple of more times at least. I love the black and white aesthetic of it.
Absolutely.
I love the fact that a lot of the stuff in that was practical.
Right.
K&B was the studio that did the practical werewolf suit and also the Man-Thing. What of Man-Thing was practical. Some of him was digital replacement, but some of him was practical. They definitely had a full-size stand-in that they used for at least lighting reference on that, and touched it up a bit with digital.
Yeah.
But I really dug it. I thought it was just the right kind of level of camp.
Definitely.
I was worried a little based on some of the stuff that once the reviews started coming out, they were all fantastic. But I'm like, once I heard they were making a Werewolf by Night thing, I was like digging through anything I could find to see if I could find anything about it, because they were keeping it really tight-lipped.
Sure.
And I had heard a lot of people talking about it being overly campy. And my opinion now is that the people that thought it was overly campy have never watched a horror movie older than like the 2000s.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Because I mean, I don't know if you can see this now, but I've got a Dracula Prince of Darkness shirt on.
Hell
or
yeah.
I guess since it's backwards, it's Alucard, something, blah, 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 whatever. You know, Hammer horror is, I love Universal horror movies, but Hammer horror movies are also just fantastic. And also a little bit campy.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
No, I mean, like, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of camp, especially in horror. Don't get me wrong. There's genres of horror that it's not called for, but yeah, especially if you're a historic horror fan. Again, getting back to some of the Universal movies, you know, kind of those iterations. There is a level of camp in them.
Oh yeah.
And then even if you're like a 60s TV fan, 60s and 70s, like things like the Addams Family, the Munsters, you know, like that is strictly camp, you know. So I just don't, I don't understand how you could hate on it. But Werewolf by Night, it had a little bit, but it wasn't anything drastic. It was the type of camp. It was just the right measurement of camp in the sense that it made it not take itself too seriously.
Yeah, they use it very sparingly, and they see what I was worried about is I don't even think I'd have minded if it had been a little bit campier, but it's part of a film series, and so you don't want to go too tonally inconsistent with the rest of the series.
Right.
So, you know, it was probably a good move, them pulling back on it as much as they did, but like I could have taken a little bit more, I think.
Sure.
But yeah, I loved it. I thought it was fantastic.
The actor playing Gael Garcia Bernal, he's a great actor. You know, like I've seen more of his work like 20 years ago. You know, like Amona Perez and stuff like that, and Imatu Tambien. You know, like he's excellent in those movies. But you know, he's excellent in this, and I'm really looking forward. You know, like the whole buddy cop dynamic almost between Man Thing and the Werewolf by Night. You know, his character.
Yeah,
like that was fantastic as well. Like I know that everybody walked away wanting more of that buddy dynamic, you know, on screen. So it was a case where they left you wanting more, but in a good way.
And the thing that I think was kind of hopeful about that, again, because I don't know if this is clear, I have a little bit of an obsessive personality. But, you know, I was kind of worried whenever they cast Gael Garcia Bernal in that he was not going to do any more as the character, because, you know, he's a fairly like respected actor who does like stuff that's not Marvel movies. Yeah,
usually art house type stuff, and you know, he's middle-aged actor now, you know, getting up there.
But I saw him like on a red carpet interview, and he talked about like wanting to explore more about the character, and he seemed like genuinely very excited about it.
Right.
So I feel like if a dude that caliber of an actor wants to work on a project and work on a character again, it's probably not the last we've seen of those characters.
Right. And I thought it was really interesting, you know, who actually directed that as well. You know, normally Michael, I forget how you enunciate his last name, Giacchino. He normally
I believe
does
that's right.
Like he does music for films, but, and he did it for this movie, but he actually directed it as well. So,
and that score over the end credits. That score over the end credits was fantastic.
Oh, absolutely! Like I was really pleased. Like I felt like tonally just had everything right, you know. And he's done a lot of stuff in the past. You know, he's done things with Pixar and Mission Impossible movies, Jurassic World. You know, like his scores are relatively popular. You wouldn't think like, oh, he's just going to start making movies now, right. You know. But and then for like this to be a banger out the gate, like I love it. It's like perhaps the best werewolf related thing I've seen in 20 years, I would think. And, you know, but I really enjoyed it as well. I had to ask you about it while I had you, if you hadn't seen it. Because I feel like it does take a lot from like the older Universal movies outside of just the aesthetic of the film and being in black and white, and the makeup effects even too, like what the finished product with the werewolf and stuff is as well. And the fact that some of those earlier conversations we were having with the Universal werewolves.
Yeah, and the fact that they went with that design for him instead of going with the more modern design that he'd had over. Well, I say modern. in the 80s, they redesigned him to look like Eddie Quist from The Howling. And then, like, gradually over time, he sort of reverted back to looking like a Wolfman again.
Right.
So, you know, that was nice to see that he basically was just straight up translated directly off of the page in terms of that, you know, short-snouted Wolfman look.
Right.
Before we get you off here, Logan, I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about anything more recently in film or television that you've enjoyed have a real appreciation for from either whether it's makeup effects or mask making and implementation in any type of work out there that you'd like to talk about.
Oh, geez. Well, I mean, we've talked about some of the recent makeup effects stuff that I've really appreciated. Is Mike Marino's work is, I would say, probably some of the best character work that is being done today. He's a guy that if I see his company is working on anything, or I see his name come up in the credits of anything, I'm immediately interested in it because I know that there's going to be some really, really compelling character makeups in there. They're very technically interesting and technically well pulled off. This is not a movie or anything, but I recently got a book, and I'm totally blanking on the name of it, but it's a makeup effects history book that was put out by Howard Berger of K&B Effects.
Okay.
And I just recently started reading through it. It's really cool. It's a sort of retrospective on the history of makeup effects as a whole, and they take little sound bites from different makeup effects artists about different topics. The first chapter is all about the Universal horror films, and every bit of it is just like different makeup effects artists and different filmmakers sort of talking about how influential those were and you know, interesting things surrounding that stuff. So that's a really cool book that I'm reading and I'm very inspired by at the moment. So there is that. I recently finished Dahmer. What is it called? Dahmer Monster: the Jeffrey Dahmer story. The worst fucking title for anything.
I agree.
Despite the fact that like it was actually a pretty solid show. And that, so I know there's been, you know, there are different opinions on like true crime stuff, and I personally like to see it be a bit more respectful, and not to get too in the weeds on this, but like, you know, there were news stories about the families of the victims being very upset by their story being told again in this. The question that I don't know that anybody has asked is, why the hell are all these news outlets bugging the family about this?
Right. Right.
So, you know, that is a thought that I had.
Throw a little salt on it.
Leave them alone. But I thought the performance was really good, and I thought the period makeups for that were really good. It's an interesting case of like, I'm not quite old enough to remember Jeffrey Dahmer's trial, but I grew up in the 90s, and so it's interesting to see period makeups from a period that I remember.
Right.
And, you know, there's a lot of hair and wardrobe and makeup that goes into making that convincingly the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, depending on what era of the story they're telling. And that stuff, I mean, there's a reason that those are the types of things that typically win the awards for, you know, best hair and makeup, is because it's a lot of work. And
Absolutely.
You know, you're going to have audience members that lived through those time periods, and they can instantly see through whether, you know, like whether you've been accurate and genuine with that, or whether you're just like, we've got a modern actor and we're going to throw him in a flannel or whatever, you know?
Right. Yeah. And they look at those set design pieces and things like that. Like, is that a 1985 Aries K car, or did you just dumb down a Ford Taurus, that came out 10 years ago to try and look like it, So, but yeah, there's little things in series like that I find myself enjoying, is looking at the set pieces and how accurate they are getting with the times. That even it's an easy one to pick out for me, but like vehicles, but that's one that's a little bit more obvious. But yeah, I haven't gotten a chance to see Dahmer yet myself, but I know Josh has. But I have seen plenty of the hubbub about it. I don't think Netflix did themselves a lot of favors because I think they tried to tag it or market it as an LGBTQT plus story.
They actually did.
Yeah.
It was like in that category, I think. And I'm like, oh,
I understand that Dahmer, as far as his preferences, might have landed in one of those descriptors, but it's not an inspirational story of the ages for those folks, and I don't think
they're brutalized by a monster, right?
Right.
Wasn't the Babadook also listed as an LGBTQ thing on Netflix?
It might have been. I know that there's a few occasions that I had noticed, but I didn't make a scene about it. But I know there's been times that I've seen LGBTQ plus tag stories on Netflix. I'm like, why?
Yeah, why would you do this?
But I think sometimes it's just because maybe like there's a prominent person or actor in it or director that might be, one of those descriptors, and
could be AI generated too.
Well, that could be as well.
And the best thing to come out of that whole Babadook being misfiled is that, and I'm not sure if that's true or if that was just a joke somebody did, but the best thing to come out of that is that the Babadook became a gay icon, and so like you can see all these pictures from pride parades and stuff of people dressed up as the Babadook just in the middle of everything.
Like a representation of gay and the LGBT.
Yeah.
Just a case of making the best of a bad situation, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, Logan, I know that we had a hell of a time talking to you today, and definitely appreciate the variety and the insight that you brought to the program for us this week. And we'd certainly love to have you back on at some point, especially if there's some good piece of cinema out there that we can have a conversation about some of the makeup effects and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we love having artists on, man, and your medium is special to our type. So appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to be back on. So just shoot me a message anytime.
Absolutely. Anybody that's watching with us live, thank you guys for tuning in the conversation with Logan Cole today. We're going to be tagging him on our social media feeds, of course. We've been doing that up to this point. So you can keep tabs on Logan and his work. And maybe there's some unsuspecting and casual viewers out there that might want to employ his services in the future. So in our conversations earlier, hit him up on Instagram.
Hell yeah, man. Go check it out.
Very responsive. So, Logan, thank you for your time today, sir. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you some other time. All right.
All right.
Care, Logan.
Take care.
See you, man.
Have a good one, guys.
All right.
Hey, this is Josh from ATI Podcast. For show updates and news about the podcast, follow us on social media. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/ATI Podcast 22, on Twitter at podcast_ATI, on Instagram at the ATI Podcast, on TikTok at ATI Podcast. DMs are always welcome. Have a question for the show? You can always email us at atipodcastquestions@gmail.com. Stay safe out there.